Joining me now is National Security Adviser Jake Sullivan. Jake, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here on a busy day. So, Jake, let's just dive right in. Overnight, the State Department confirmed the deaths of 29 U.S. citizens in this conflict. Can the U.S. say whether any U.S. citizens have been killed inside Gaza?
We can't confirm that at this time, Kristen, but we are working actively to determine the fate of Americans in Gaza, both those being held hostage, and we are also working actively to try to help American citizens who want to leave Gaza have safe passage out through the border crossing with Egypt. It has been difficult to execute that operation to facilitate their passage out. We are continuing to work that, and President Biden has put a team on it around the clock because it's a high priority for us to be able to get American citizens out of Gaza. It is also his highest priority to secure the safe return of those Americans being held hostage by the brutal and vicious terrorist group Hamas. And we are working multiple angles to try to make that happen, but I'm cautious about what I can say publicly on it.
Jake, I want to ask you about both. Let's talk about the efforts to get citizens out. The UN says evacuating civilians to the south is, quote, impossible and potentially calamitous. Realistically, Jake, where are people supposed to go? Are they not trapped inside Gaza at this point?
The critical thing from our perspective is that there be safe places for civilians to go that will not be subject to military bombardment, where they can be safe physically and where they can have access to the essentials, to food, water, medicine, shelter. The many Palestinians who have had nothing to do with the brutal terrorist organization Hamas, the vast majority of the population of Gaza, they deserve dignity, they deserve safety and security, and the United States is working with the United Nations, with Israel, with Egypt, with Jordan, and with other organizations to try to ensure that.
And just to be very clear, has anyone, U.S. citizen or otherwise, been able to leave Gaza?
So far, we have not been able to get American citizens through the border crossing, and I'm not aware of anyone else being able to get out at this time, though I cannot fully confirm that because it's a dynamic situation. Like I said, we're trying to create the circumstances where American citizens who are in Gaza and are looking to leave to get into Egypt and ultimately to the United States or elsewhere, that they are able to do so. We're working on that as we speak.
Jake, did the U.S. ask Israel to delay its ground offensive so that you and Egypt can try to secure the safe passage of civilians?
First, I'm not going to get into our private conversations with the Israelis, but we are not interfering in their military planning or trying to give them instructions or requests specific to their military planning. What we are doing is saying privately what we've said publicly, which is that all military operations should be conducted consistent with the law of war, that civilians should be protected, that civilians should have a real opportunity to get to safety, and that civilians, again, who have nothing to do with Hamas, because Hamas is a brutal, vicious, savage terrorist group. It does not represent or reflect the will of the Palestinian people, that civilians get access to food, water, medicine, and shelter, and we are working hard on that. It is a key priority for our president.
I know you don't want to get into private conversations, but I don't hear a denial. I mean, can you deny that you asked Israel to hold off on its ground offensive?
Well, Kristen, as I just said, we are not making requests or demands of Israel with respect to its military operations. We are simply stating our basic principles, the principles upon which this country is based, and all democracies, including Israel, are based. It's what makes us different from the terrorists, that in fact we respect civilian life. But I will tell you, we did not say to them, you've got to do this or that with respect to the specifics of the specific operational planning for the military operation.
Okay. NBC is reporting that U.S. officials have been privately urging restraint to the Israeli government, and yet a State Department email advised against officials using language like de-escalation and restoring calm. So which is it, Jake? Can you help clarify what is the message to the U.S. government to Israel?
The message to the U.S. government has actually been straightforward from the first time the president spoke to this issue. Israel has a right and indeed a duty to defend itself against vicious, savage, barbaric terrorism. Israel also, as a fellow democracy, has to respect the laws of war, and all civilians should be protected and should have access to the basic necessities. And that has been the U.S. position. That is what we will continue to discuss with our Israeli counterparts, with regional counterparts, and with the United Nations. And we will do all that we can to ensure the safety of civilians in Gaza.
Jake, is there a red line for the U.S. when it comes to Israel's actions? For example, is the use of phosphorus bombs off the table for the U.S.?
I have seen the reports of that. The IDF has actually come out and said they were not using phosphorus bombs. I'm not going to sit here, Kristen, and draw red lines. I was asked this same question at the White House podium a few days ago, and I said, you know, it's not my job in public to draw red lines. It's my job and the job of the U.S. government to have detailed, extensive conversations with our Israeli counterparts and to continue to stand behind the basic principles of the laws of war and the rule of law.
Former Obama National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes said this week, quote, "The decisions being made now are going to impact millions of lives, reverberate for generations, and risk all kinds of escalation. The U.S. should have learned from 9/11 the profound cost of being guided by anger and fear. I hope that is what we are telling the Israeli government." Is that what we're telling the Israeli government? Jake, in big picture, who will govern Gaza if Israel succeeds in defeating Hamas?
Well, again, Kristen, as frustrating as it may be, I have to be careful about revealing the sensitive private conversations that we're having with our Israeli counterparts. Of course they're angry. I'm angry. We should all be angry about this outrage of a terrorist attack that has taken place and claimed the lives of 1,300 people. As President Biden said last night, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. But of course, at the same time, any effort to strike a brutal to strike a blow against Hamas should be done consistent with clear objectives and should also be done in a way that protects innocent civilians.
But who will govern Gaza?
We have been clear
do
about.
Do you know? Has Israel said what their plan is? Who will govern Gaza?
I can't sit here today and tell you what the exact outcome of this military operation will be, either militarily or politically. What I can tell you is that the United States, sitting with our Israeli counterparts, are talking through all of the dimensions, including questions related to governance as we go forward. And it is simply premature sitting here today to talk about what the future holds in that regard.
Do they have an exit strategy, Jake?
Right now, the issue is not exit strategy. Right now, they are still facing rocket attacks, and they are still facing the very serious threat that Hamas can continue to kill Israeli civilians, women, children, the elderly. And so right now, the Israeli focus is on neutralizing that threat, destroying that threat, so that Israel can live in security and dignity. And the United States is going to continue to support them in that effort, even as we discuss with them all of the larger strategic questions to ensure that over the medium term and the long term, the state of Israel is secure, the state of Israel is sustained.
Jake, as you know, there's been a lot of discussion about how this attack could have been missed. I want to play you some remarks that you made just 8 days before the attack and get your reaction on the other side.
The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. Now, challenges remain. Iran's nuclear weapons program, the tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. But the amount of time that I have to spend on crisis and conflict in the Middle East today compared to any of my predecessors going back to 9/11 is significantly reduced.
Jake, why was your assessment there so far off the mark?
Well, first, Kristen, I made those comments in the context of developments in the wider Middle East region over the last few years, after 2 decades that involved a civil war in Yemen and a massive humanitarian catastrophe, a civil war in Syria and a massive refugee crisis, an invasion and insurgency in Iraq, a NATO military operation in Libya, Iranian-backed attacks on both Saudi and the UAE, as well as many other steps, including the rise of a terrorist caliphate that actually occupied a huge amount of territory. The sentence before what you just played, I said, in fact, that this was for now and that it could all change. And the two threats that I identified that were the most acute on my mind at the time were tensions between Israelis and Palestinians, as I mentioned, and the threat from Iran. And so, yes, it is true that those two threats remained a real challenge to the long-term stability of the Middle East region, and we've just seen this absolutely tragic attack. But at no point did the Biden administration take its eye off the ball of the threats to Israel. In fact, President Biden saw Prime Minister Netanyahu just weeks before this attack to discuss the security challenges facing the state of Israel, and we've continued to support them to as significant or greater an extent than any previous administration.
Jake, I want to ask you about that deal with Iran. The U.S. and Qatar announcing on Thursday that it would freeze Iran's access to that $6 billion in oil funds, which were originally set to be released as a part of that hostage exchange. The administration has emphasized that not a penny of the funds were spent or could have contributed to the attack. But if that's true, why did the U.S. freeze the funds in the first place?
Well, first, not a dime of that money has been spent. I'm not going to get into the diplomatic conversations that we've been having with partners in the region. But I will point this out because I think it's important. It was the previous administration that actually set the system up that allowed humanitarian funds to be spent on food and medicine and other humanitarian supplies. And in fact, Iran spent down billions of dollars from those accounts during the previous administration. Now, I don't recall, Kristen, people raising a hue and cry that the previous administration was allowing Iran to spend money on terrorism. And the reason we didn't hear that is because it's not true. And it wouldn't be true today either. This is a bad faith argument. This money goes not to Iran, but to the purchase of food and medicine and cannot be used to buy weapons or anything else. That was true in the previous administration. It would be true today. And so this focus on the $6 billion, I do think, is misplaced. But at the same time, we have been clear that not a dime of that money has so far been spent.
Jake, very quickly before I let you go, obviously there had been talks about a deal for normalized relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel prior to this horrific attack. We know that Secretary Blinken met with the Saudi Crown Prince. What is the status of that deal? Are talks off for now?
Well, actually, Secretary Blinken was just in Saudi Arabia. I just had the opportunity to see the Crown Prince and other senior officials in that government as part of a region-wide tour where he's been talking to the leaders of all or many of the major Middle Eastern countries. For the moment, the focus has to be on helping Israel defend itself against the brutal terrorism of Hamas. And we will have opportunities as we go forward to look at diplomatic initiatives like normalization that help lead to a long-term, more stable, more integrated region.
I hear you saying they're on pause for now. The talks are not continuing right now?
There's not some kind of formal pause. We're not, pressing a button. I would just say that the main effort and emphasis from a diplomatic perspective of the United States today is on the immediate situation. But the long-term goal of a more peaceful, more integrated Middle East region, including through normalization, remains very much a focus of U.S. foreign policy.
All right, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.